Hey, my name is Willson. This is my 20-minute presentation for firefighter instructor course number 1 and number 2. Today my presentation is going to be on water supply and all that water supply entails in the fire service. At the end of my presentation, I'll be teaching a class of students for around 20 minutes. At the end of my presentation, there will be a 10-question quiz. The quiz can consist of true and false and multiple choice questions, and this quiz will pretty much cover everything that is in this water supply lecture. Now I'll go ahead and get started with my lecture, and I'll start with the objectives of my lesson. The lesson objectives today, we will discuss different types of supply hose in the fire service. Here behind me, I'll get into more detail, but here behind me I have one of our supply hoses that we use in the Ridgeland Fire Department. It's a 3-inch supply hose. It's a smaller supply hose. We'll demonstrate how to connect to a fire hydrant. Here's a fire hydrant. We'll get more into that later. We'll ensure that students can operate fire hydrants. There are different water sources in the fire service, whether that's static, whether that is coming from a tanker truck, or whether that's coming from a continuous source like a fire hydrant. And we'll get more into that as we go. And then water plays a huge role in the fire service, and we'll get more into the roles that water does play and the different ways that water does make a role. There are multiple classes of fire hydrants, and we'll get into the different types of classes, the different PSI with each, and the different color ranges with each to let you know when you see that color range, what PSI that correlates to. There are different types of hose couplings in the fire service, whether that's a Storks connection, which usually is the biggest connection on a major green, on a yellow LDH that connects to the steamer part of a hydrant. This hydrant here, if you take a look, does not have a steamer, but most hydrants in the city of Ridgeland do, and that's your major LDH Storks connection. We'll get into that later. These are still the lesson objectives. There are different types of hose couplings, you know, reducers, adapters, and the Storks, and the threaded coupling. There are different types of hose lays in the fire service, whether that's a forward lay or a reverse lay. Reverse lay and forward lay are pretty much opposites of each other, and later on in my PowerPoint presentation I will get into that. And we'll demonstrate how to effectively establish a water source. So what I'm reading off here, if you zoom in on it, is my printed off multimedia presentation, my PowerPoint. So I have a PowerPoint multimedia presentation, and then I have my fire hydrant and my supply hoses as my secondary tools to better kind of get my point across and get to use examples. So those were my lesson objectives. Now I'm going to transition into the first topic, and that's just going to be the key facets of water supply. Water is very critical in a multitude of reasons. Water is our #1 defense in fighting fire, and water is also our #1 offense. Water also plays a huge role in the defensive side on protecting exposures. Exposures are when you have a fire and there's adjacent houses towards that fire can create enough heat to release enough off gas on that next house to ignite that next house, and that's definitely not what we want to see as firefighters. So we'll send a firefighter to protect the exposure, which means he'll have a charged hand line, and he'll just be kind of creating a wall of water to keep the heat down on that exposed house to not let that thing catch fire. Another thing about water supply is whenever you pull up on a fire and you're fighting off tank water at first, you want to be able to smoothly and efficiently change from a continuous static source such as a fire hydrant, hook it to your intake, and smoothly transition from that tank water to your hydrant water. The reason we need to do that so smoothly is, number one, because the firefighters on the other end of the line, that water is their lifeline. That's how they stay alive in there. That's their protector. And another reason is if you don't do it smoothly and you don't have a pressure governor on your truck, a lot of older trucks don't have pressure governors, that PSI on that nozzle, when you open that intake, will shoot way high, and it's a lot for that firefighter to hold, especially if there's a one man on that firefighter on that hose line. Normally it's supposed to be 2, sometimes 3, but either way, it's a lot of PSI pressure to hold for a firefighter on the other end of that line. So we like to make the changeover as smooth as possible. We're going to make the transition now through my multimedia PowerPoint into the sources of water. Sources of water, we'll first start with the static sources. So if you turn around here, you can see that we have a static source of water here. We're right by the reservoir, right outside my Station 3. Our fire truck, or engine truck, is equipped with 2 hard suction hoses that, if we needed to, we could draft water from this static source and fight fire with it. But here you see we have fire hydrants in the city of Ridgeland, pretty readily available, and they have a lot of PSI naturally on them. So we don't really need to use this static source, but that's just an example of what a static source is, and we have the capabilities through hard suction hose to draft that water and use it. Tank water, which is used in our truck. We have 500 gallons of tank water on our fire truck. But in rural areas where there aren't fire hydrants as much, you see tanker trucks that just carry strictly, tank trucks carry just water, and they come to the scene and you're able to draft out of the tank truck if there wasn't a body of water so readily like the reservoir. There are 2 types of fire hydrants. There's wet barrel and there's dry barrel fire hydrants. Wet barrel fire hydrants are mostly, maybe I would say in like Florida, places that don't ever freeze because there's actually water in the barrel of the fire hydrant. So if you had a fire and it was sub-freezing temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and you tried to open that hydrant, that water will be frozen and you're not going to get any water out. So places even like Mississippi where it doesn't get that cold, we have a dry barrel fire hydrant, which means the water is underground and we have to open it through a valve to get water out. Fire hydrants have a specific feet per distance that they're spaced out, whether that's in a residential area or a commercial area. In residential areas, fire hydrants are usually 500 feet apart, so in your neighborhoods, you can pretty much bank on you'll see a fire hydrant every 500 feet. In residential areas, in commercial areas where there's maybe more traffic with people, there's fire hydrants every 250 feet. A lot of times in commercial areas, there's bigger buildings, and they may need more fire hydrants to accompany the bigger buildings in the more populated area. So now we're going to move into opening the fire hydrant. It's a very basic tool, but it's one of the most important tools in the fire service, especially when you're dealing with water supply, and that's the topic of our presentation in our class today. So here we have a fire hydrant. The main tool to open a fire hydrant is called your hydrant wrench, and the hydrant wrench just sits right on top of this valve, and you open it. You always open a fire hydrant counterclockwise, so you would just hook it onto the valve, and you would open it counterclockwise or to the left, and open it all the way up until it meets resistance, and your fire hydrant would be open. But we'll go back to the beginning. When you walk up to a fire hydrant, you want to open it up, look inside, make sure there's no obstructions in your fire hydrant. Usually this is opening the steamer. You want to make sure the rest of the caps are tight so that when you open that steamer, it doesn't blow off the other caps. What we do at first as firefighters, we get on there and we kind of purge the fire hydrant to get all the debris and the gunk out from in the fire hydrant so that doesn't travel up in our hose. After you get that gunk out of there and all that mud and dirt and debris, you can shut your fire hydrant back off, and at that point you'll just wait for your driver operator or your captain to tell you that it's time to hook your hose up and go ahead and flow water to the intake of the truck. But that's pretty much opening the hydrant, and then we get into a transition over slightly to shutting the hydrant down, which is basically the exact opposite of that. You'll turn the hydrant wrench, which is about 1 foot long, and it just sits on this cap. You'll turn it clockwise to the right, just to close that fire hydrant up. Disconnecting the hose, you can let hose. This is perfect for disconnecting. You can let that hose flow down that hill, and gravity would just clear that water out of that hose line. And then it's easy to roll those hoses back up. And obviously, when you leave a fire hydrant, you want to put the caps back on tightly and securely. And that's the basics of opening and closing a fire hydrant. We're going to transition over. And I'm just using this multimedia PowerPoint as an outline. And I will upload this to the email. So now that we're still at the fire hydrant, I'm going to talk about the different classes of fire hydrants. I'm going to go from most powerful in terms of gallons per minute to the least powerful. The most powerful is a AA fire hydrant. Normally you'll see those light blue in color, and they produce more than 1,500 gallons per minute. These hydrants are normally found in military applications, oil refineries, or other large, complex industrial areas. Is everything good with it? The next type of fire hydrant, going from most powerful or most GPM to the least, is a Class A. Those are green in color most of the time, and they're from 1,000 to 1,499 gallons per minute. They're used in large, complex industrial areas. The third, there's 4 categories of fire hydrant. This is the third, and it's going to be the Class B. It's orange in color. And these fire hydrants are 500 to 999 gallons per minute, and they're typically found in commercial areas, you know, your shopping centers and all that. The residential ones that you always see that are red in color are less than 500 gallons per minute. They're called a Class C fire hydrant, and they're most common used in residential areas, and there are a lot through the city of Ridgeland. We'll transition into something that's very, very important in water supply, and it's what supplies your water. It's your supply line, and here I brought 2 fire hoses. The whitish tan fire hose under the attack line is our supply hose. That's a smaller supply hose. I wasn't able to bring our big LDH supply hose that's yellow with the Storks connection. I wasn't able to bring that one over, but I still do have a supply hose. This supply hose can hook to the 3-inch intake on our fire truck and supply the truck with a continuous water source from a fire hydrant. It doesn't give as much pressure, as it won't fill your PSI on your intake as high as an LDH, a green Storks LDH will, but this thing will still get the job done. It'll allow you to flow 2 hand lines and a master stream. The ranges from supply lines goes from 2.5 inches to all the way up to 6 inches. This is a 3-inch supply line, and we supply our fire truck with a 5-inch LDH. LDHs are designed to carry large amounts of water at lower pressures than attack lines, and this here, the orange one, is our 1.5-inch attack line. Medium diameter hoses are 2.5 to 3 inches. They can supply they can be a supply or an attack line. It's really, if you're going to use a 3-inch as an attack line or a 2.5 as an attack line, it's more to possibly protect an exposure, or it's going to be to fight from an external way. You pull that hose line, you can hook it to your discharge, a 3-inch straight to your discharge, and flow that discharge, and you can sit on that hose and fight fire from the outside. You're not going to want to be fighting interior attacks with a 2.5 or 3-inch supply line, but it's something you could do, but it's more of just to supply water to the truck. LDH hoses, or large diameter hoses, are 3.5 to 6-inch hoses. Those are used for only supply. Those are way too heavy to try to carry in a house or do anything like that. They have a lot less friction loss than the other previous hoses, because the larger the opening, the less friction is. So these are larger, so they have less friction. They move water lose more water than the small attack lines. So we'll get into the different types of hose couplings. And there's two types of hose couplings. If you come down here and check these out, these are your threaded couplings. This here is the female side. And in the city of Ridgeland, when we have a good hose that's still in service, if you could come check out this, we tuck the male end to the inside. The male end has the threads exposed, and the female end has the threads hidden, and it has the swivel. So that's the coupling side of a threaded hose line. There's a secondary hose line that has, for major LDH hoses, it's called a Storks connection, and it connects by just a turn to the right, and it's used for a quicker access to hook to the intake of the fire truck. But the thing about a Storks connection hose line is if you want to connect it to a fire hydrants are threaded and Storks connection hoses are not threaded. So you would need, when we talked about adapters and reducers, you would need an adapter that can hook to a Stork side but has threaded couplings, the female end of a threaded coupling that can screw onto the fire hydrant, and that's how we have ours pre-connected on our fire truck. We have our LDH hose with the Storks connection, but it's got an adapter to a 5-inch steamer with threaded couplings. There are multiple types of connections. There's a Y and there's a Siamese connection. Y connections are one hose line turns into two, and a major thing that Y connections are used for is when you're fighting a high-rise fire and you have to supply the FDC through two discharges. You can take that Y connection up to each floor and connect to the FDC, the fire department connection, on that certain floor, and hook it to the FDC connection. Ys have gated valves on both sides, so what you do is you hook that Y to the gated connection on each floor, and you close both valves, gated ball valves, hook your hoses up to it, flow the building with water, and then you can open the gated valve on each floor whenever you want, and you'll have water to that floor through that gated Y. Also, you can stretch out a 3-inch discharge from your truck, take it down, and then hook that gated Y to the end of that hose, and you can have two attack lines going off the end of that gated Y. So gated Ys are very useful in the fire service. They're used all the time, and they're very beneficial. The opposite of a gated Y is called a Siamese connection. Siamese connections are a lot of times used as an intake on a truck, and they have a gated valve, ball valve as well. Siamese connections are two hose lines into one, so you can feed. Perfect example is this right here. If we were fighting fire with this fire hydrant, we could hook up two hose lines to this and feed them straight into our Siamese connection. That's two hose lines into one intake. Reducers allow a smaller diameter hose. So a reducer would be if you're on the fire truck and we have a 3-inch intake, or a 3-inch discharge to fit this hose, but we want to put an attack line straight off that discharge, you can get a reducer from a 3-inch reducer to a 1 3/4 or 1.5 inches, and you can hook that 3-inch reducer on there to 1.5 inches and hook that 1.5 inch hose line straight to that reducer, and you can flow a discharge straight out of an attack line. There are double male and there are also double female adapters. I'm going to get real quick into the type of hose lays. There are forward hose lays and there are reverse hose lays. Ridgeland Fire Department uses a forward hose lay. Forward hose lay would be, you get out of the truck, you do what we talked about with the fire hydrant earlier, wrap the hose around, they go from the fire hydrant to the fire. You supply water from the fire hydrant to the fire. A reverse hose lay would be the fire truck's on scene, the firefighter and the officer get out, they're fighting with tank water, the secondary engine gets up, pulls a hose line from the engine truck they take the hose line off the engine and they head to the fire. So it's engine, fire to hydrant with a reverse, hydrant to fire with a forward lay. It's a very simple concept and it's used very often, but some people get them backwards or confused. City of Ridgeland uses the forward hose lay, so we use hydrant to fire. In summary, I'm just going to read off our summary, and I'll also post this so you students can look at it. Water supply can come from a fire apparatus, hydrant, or static water source. Operating a hydrant is critical in supplying a municipal water source. There are multiple types of fire hydrants: red, green, orange, and light blue, and that's C, B, A, and AA. Supply lines range from 2.5 to 6 inches. Hose couplings are used to attach hoses together and to hydrants. Remember we talked about the Ys, the Siamese connections. Ys are 1 to 2, Siamese is 2 hoses to 1. We talked about reducers, adapters, forward hose lays, which is hydrant to fire, and reverse hose lays, which is fire to hydrant. And that's the summary. I have a 10-question quiz that encompasses everything that we just talked about in the water supply lecture. This will be posted online for y'all to take, and the water supply PowerPoint will also be posted online. My name is Willson. I'm with the Ridgeland Fire Department, and that was my presentation on water supply.